we need the natural world. There's this growing body of evidence that suggests that time spent in nature is good for our moods, our health, our psychology, so many things. And not only is it good for us, but it's good for us in ways that nothing else that we know of can provide. It's not something that we prefer to have around. It's something we really need to have. We need to have access to nature.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm with the author and journalist J.B. MacKinnon, who co-authored the best-selling 100-Mile Diet, A Year of Local Eating, which I have stories about. He also is the author of The Once and Future World, Nature as It Was, as It Is, and as It Could Be. James, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for starting us on the 100-Mile Diet, actually. I found when I did it for 1 week, back when you wrote it, the first ingredient I knew wasn't local that I wanted was salt.
Right. Yeah.
Which is going to be true for probably a lot of inland people.
Often a challenge. Yeah.
And thank you. I mean, your book helped us all think in a different way for the local food movement. I bet you've gotten a lot of feedback on it.
Yeah, it was quite an adventure. Finishing that book and then taking it out, and I mean, when my partner Elise and I did the 100-Mile Diet, it was just this personal experiment between the two of us, and it was pretty extraordinary to see what happened when we took that out to the wider world and saw it take off. You know, it really took off. Yeah, and it went in directions that we could never have expected.
Like?
Well, it went beyond 100-mile diet. It eventually it became things like 100-mile art and 100-mile architecture and 100-mile clothing, and I even saw 100-mile mortgages in one place. So it became this bigger meme about relocalization as a whole, and we certainly never anticipated either the degree to which it would excite people in terms of local eating, or the degree to which it would become this even bigger
I think it was
concept.
an idea, actually it was the catalyst for an idea that whose time had come.
Absolutely, yeah.
For many local pride, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there had been local food activists out there hard at work for a long time, but there just needed to be that little spark, and you never know where it's going to come from. And in this case, we were fortunate enough to help contribute to that.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody for that. I mean, since we're about locally reliant living, I mean, that's part of the meme that we too are wanting to build on, for sure. Shifting gears to your newest book, the Once and Future World. You start us out with your childhood and looking at how different that landscape is now than it was back then. So you start us looking at landscapes. And I want to jump to the early part of your book when you say, we live in a 10% world. Tell us what you mean by that and what it was when it wasn't 10%.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that we live in a 10% world is rooted in this growing body of research and evidence that suggests that when what we think of as nature today has been depleted by 90% in many cases. So we look at the great whales, we look at the bison, we look at the number of songbirds, we look at the number of fish returning to our rivers to spawn. You get a stack of studies and read through them, which is what I was doing as I worked on this book, and I just kept hitting this number, 90% decline, 90% decline, 90% decline, on a lot of the kind of big ticket, issues of the natural world, and I started to realize that in a short form rule of thumb kind of way, what we're looking at today is a 10% world, and of course when there's sadness and loss associated with that realization, but on the other hand there's this inspiring, sudden and inspiring opportunity to picture the 100% world, right? And when you read back through these sorts of early explorers journals and sea captains' diaries and things like this that I was digging through as I worked on this book, I found myself really, the pleasure of the work was getting to inhabit that world by reading about it and, imagining myself standing on the shore and listening to whales, breathing out in the harbor as one, early pioneer in this area described, or, canoeing in the Caribbean Sea when there were 90 million sea turtles, or witnessing the prairies, with that full, not only the prairies, but, almost the entire continent when there were bison from not only on the Great Plains, but in Florida, in California.
That was one of the big surprises. I mean, that was one of the delights of reading this, is that you unearthed some realities like that had a clue that you would see them in the Rockies.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Bison in the Rockies, grizzly bears in the Great Plains, walruses showing up in Boston Harbor, the California condor flying over the skies of Vancouver, where I live. There's just this lineup of surprises for me. It really, when you go back and look at the history of nature, it's almost as though you're visiting another planet. It's that different. It's that extraordinary.
That was one of the richest parts of. I celebrated with you getting to read that, and I got to grieve as well because it told me not only, those wonderful rare sightings that we have of Vancouver. As you mentioned, the whale that came in through the inlet, and it's like, so we still have that kind of wonder, even though it's rare at this point.
Yeah, even coming to speak with you today, I was coming up the road and there was a coyote. I hadn't seen one in the city for a while, but there was one running along one of the boulevards, and all the traffic was slowing down as people stopped to kind of admire this little fragment of the wild in the city. And we certainly still have a very powerful attraction and draw to it. What we don't really have is the actual cultural understandings necessary to really live alongside the natural world that we've really lost as we've become disconnected, not only by the movement of people from the rural world to the urban world, but increasingly through the fact that we spend so much time in the virtual world.
Of course. So that this generation, we don't even have. So the only animals, say, or the wild places we're going to see, are all two-dimensional on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And we really don't know how to behave with them as well. But I want to bring it back around the other way. How could you imagine? How could you imagine humans now adapting to living with, or inviting in, maybe, the wilder world?
The way I can imagine it is doing it very slowly. I think that we need to do it. We need to rewild the worlds that we live in for a variety of reasons. But I mean, partly we need to do it in order to build a richer natural world as a whole. And we can't do that simply by protecting and setting aside parks and protected areas. We human beings inhabit so much of the world and use so much of the world that we also have to build the wild back into our living spaces if we want to have anything like that world that I revisit in the past in this book. But we also need to do it for ourselves. We need the natural world. There's this growing body of evidence that suggests that time spent in nature is good for our moods, our health, our psychology, so many things. And not only is it good for us, but it's good for us in ways that nothing else that we know of can provide. It's not something that we prefer to have around. It's something we really need to have. We need to have access to nature. So we need to become more active in rebuilding it into the places we live, and we can do that, I think. You don't go straight to releasing tigers in the Great Plains, or lions in the Great Plains, which did used to live there. You start small, and you take the simple steps that are necessary to kind of recondition ourselves and rebuild a cultural connection to the natural world that we can then deepen. That's
the tension that I feel here is that with most people, with 80% of the world is urban or suburban, and of which certainly the predators are mostly gone from those areas and thus their prey. And so we have some really hardy survivors, raccoons in the neighborhood and crows. But to really introduce wild, how do we do that in this 80% urban world in a way that nature has a chance of having its own terms, I guess I'd think.
Yeah, I think of examples like in the city we're in right now, Vancouver, once had 120 kilometers of fish-producing streams right within the city limits. We've lost almost all of those. They're almost entirely buried by the city. But there's been this small but growing movement to what they call daylight the streams, bring them back to the surface. And so over the last 2 years, we've had these very small salmon runs, spawning salmon returning to the city, spawning within the urban fabric for the first time in more than 50 years. So there are those small acts of rewilding that we can accomplish now. And another example from this city, grizzly bears are now living within 50 kilometers of downtown Vancouver.
That's exciting.
It is, yeah. They've returned. They've rewilded themselves to valleys that they were hunted out of in the past. And the expectation is that they will start to live closer and closer to the city. And that will be where there'll be this cultural conversation that will have to happen about what behaviors do we need to change in order to make it possible to live alongside these great bears, or are we simply not prepared to do it? And it's a conversation that's going to have some. It's going to be chewy.
Yeah, I was going to say
we're going to have to work
teeth
that one
to
out.
it, but that fits with the grizzly. I understand that. In that, where Rob and I live in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and had the privilege to live where there's more wild around us than there is human. The 23 years we've been there, that feeling part of that natural community, watching them accept us, watching us tell us what their terms were. We know where Bear's path is. We know where she goes. We know where Cougar goes by.
Yeah.
And it's like that's their space. We'll honor it. We'll walk those paths on occasion, but we're not gonna. So we feel like they have been teaching us, and I can imagine that the conversation as grizzly gets closer, or as cougar gets closer, say in the Rockies, it's like, how do we create terms that work for both sides?
Yeah. One thing that's really interesting from the history of nature is that with predators in particular, I mean, I think everybody understands that when it comes to rewilding, predators are kind of the big challenge, right? If we can live with big predators that can kill and eat us, then we can live with anything. And what we learn from history is that typically it's not our fear of predators that causes us to wipe them out. Typically it's their challenge to our economic interests. So normally, we hunted out predators because they killed our livestock primarily. Often when they became very rare was the first time that they became sort of mythically terrifying. And then they're wiped out from that point on. But it's important to have that realization that when we are living with, like in the past when we lived with predators, we didn't find them as terrifying as we find them today, because we knew them, we understood them, we had a cultural grasp of how to live with them, and we've lost that. And because of that, the idea of living with them again really is terrifying.
Because that's what we're left with, is that myth, that picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All we're left with is the idea that well, if I went into the woods, there could be bears in there that might kill us. But we don't realize that we could be thinking that we could also have the knowledge, it's this time of year, the bears will be high in the mountains. Or if I meet with a bear, it'll behave in this way because, it has its cubs with it, or it needs to defend its territory or not. Or there's all of this knowledge that we've lost about how to live with these things. And we have to recognize the fact that we can regain that knowledge. It's just the first generations that have to do the hard work of regaining it do so. It is difficult. It is difficult. But their children will grow up realizing that life with predators is perfectly normal.
That's my hope. And I think there's still maybe some wise elders, First Nations people,
Absolutely.
People that are hunters, backwoods people, that are carrying that knowledge that, you don't cover education, or the re-education, if you will. But I think that's going to be a piece that we hopefully can happen.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that we talk to those people, I mean, there still are, particularly in Canada and in Alaska, there's a lot of people who still live cheek by jowl with large and dangerous animals. I mean, the community of Churchill, Manitoba, which gets invaded by polar bears every year. There's all of British Columbia, rural British Columbia, lives alongside wolves and grizzly bears, and there still are people that we can learn from and that we can look to understand that it's possible.
Stepping back for a second, in the book you mentioned that everywhere humans have gone, from the very, very beginnings, nature has been diminished.
Mm-hmm.
It was new to me that human hunters were responsible for the extinction of the megafauna here on the northern.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, I mean, that's hunter-gatherer days. We're not even talking about killing all the bison off with guns.
Yeah.
So that we are, and as we take over more of the planet, we're the most dangerous species around, it would seem.
Yeah, we absolutely are. I mean, at this point, one of the facts that surprised me the most as I was working on this was reading that humans are now the leading cause of death for a long and growing list of species. I mean, we think of the wild as this place where, life is rough and tumble and things are living and dying in rapid succession, but in many cases it's us ourselves that are doing the killing and preventing these other species from living out their life cycles. So we have a phenomenal impact, and it has been that way since the earliest forms of human society. You can't. That said, there really is no comparison between the kind of harms that were done in the distant past and what has happened in the last 500 years with this incredible accelerating global industrial culture and what it's capable of bringing to bear on the planet. There's simply no comparison.
Well, we've got destruction on steroids here.
Yeah.
Not only population growth, right? So we're using up more of the land base and fragmenting it, because that's one of your points relative to conservation. That was the 20th century. It was called something like the golden age of conservation, where we have the parks and we can, but they're such fragmented and relatively small. You pointed out that we're going to have to rewild in place, or basically as is. Though your idea of the lost island seemed to me. Tell our viewers about your lost island.
Well, the lost island actually came to me from conversations I had with biologists of various kinds, because it does seem, if you sit down with a biologist long enough, they will start to imagine what the world could look like if we basically could start all over again. If we were able to leap back in time to this, find this lost continent where human beings have never set foot, and it's just bursting with life. It has the megafauna that's been lost from most of the planet. It has these incredible fisheries that are described from early colonial accounts. So we have that world, we have that opportunity again. What would we do differently? And there's so much that we can learn from that as a thought experiment about how we might move forward and what kind of relationship we might build with nature into the future.
I love the thought experiment. It's like imagining what it would be like that the wild can get stronger on its own terms and its own interweavings, and yet my it's like. And yet, I don't want to go into the end. It's like I want that to happen too. I'm rooting for the wild.
Yeah, rewilding is a very positive vision. I mean, that's part of what's attractive about it, is that conservation, I'll say again, as I did in the book, that it was critically important as a movement, is critically important as a movement. The idea that we need to set aside and protect the last best wild places, that we need to do our utmost to hang on to these critically endangered species. All of this remains incredibly important work. But there's also this opportunity to say, well, that's not enough. We can look at what nature was in the past and say that when we look at that richer, more abundant natural world of the past, it asks us to set a higher bar for what we consider to be the normal state of nature. And from that realization, the next thing you think you have to do is rewild. The only thing we can do is rebuild nature as it was. It's and it's a compelling idea. It allows us to think less about simply hanging on to what's left, and to think, in this more creative direction of, well, how do we bring it back? How do we make cities that aren't built for only one species,
Yes.
but are built to accommodate other species? How do we build farmlands that can do that? How do we create a mine, if we have to create a mine, that also makes some space for the things that were there before the mine was? There's a lot of innovation and opportunity to think about in this.
You give me hope that some of that can happen even in the midst of the sixth extinction, and nature comes back, has bounded back after other extinctions, and climate change, and we've got a lot of factors. So we're not going to be the only ones here working. The natural world itself, it seems to me, is always ready to spring back when it can. We'll give that opportunity.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotations from somebody I interviewed was, he said about the disappearance of species. He said, well, if you don't kill them, they will live. It sounds so ridiculously obvious, and yet it's so fundamentally true. It really is the case that if we lift up the pressure of the hand of human culture, then in many cases things surge back to life.
Yeah.
I mean, we know this from marine protected areas where suddenly there are no fishing zones. They're bursting with life after just a few years. Even the protection of the whales is a good example. I mean, there's been fairly broad-scale international protection of whales since 1986, and now on this coast, for example, we see humpback whales returning in good numbers. We see large populations of gray whales. I mean, there really is cause for hope when we allow hope to happen. I think the thing that's optimistic about it is that we know that if we ease up our pressure on the natural world, then there will be results. It's certainly not too late in that sense.
Well, I mean, part of what nature is about is life wants to live, and we'll
It's
find
very good at doing
ways
it.
to do that.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether it's mold or it's fungus or it's viruses. I mean, it's this wonderfully irrepressible force unless we take it way too far, way too far. In our last 4 or 5 minutes here, other thoughts that you have that we haven't covered that are sort of at the heart of your book?
Well, I think one another issue that came out of my research that makes me feel somewhat optimistic, I guess, is that we tend to think that those of us who are paying attention to the harms that have been done to the natural world, we tend to think that it's the result of human greed. That it's just this dark, avaricious part of human nature that seems to be so unstoppable. And I think it is partly that. But it also reveals itself to be this long pattern of cultural forgetting. That this thing that they call shifting baseline syndrome, in which each generation kind of looks around itself as people are growing up and says, oh, this is the normal state of nature. And then they watch the degradation of nature during their lifetimes and they're saddened by it. But the next generation comes along and that's the new normal. For this next generation, the previous generation's degraded state of nature becomes the next generation's normal state of nature. And we really lose sight over time. It's very hard, even having worked on this book, it's hard to keep in my mind the fact that nature was such a different thing in the past. So there's something, for me, there's a little bit of forgiveness for the human species in this fact that it's not simply some dark urge we have to destroy. It's also that it's very difficult for us to hang on to the knowledge of generations. And we need to become better celebrants, I think, of history and of intergenerational knowledge. And we need to work harder at it. We need to pay more attention to the natural world so that it can tell us.
And how do we do that? I mean, I understood about the shifting baselines, and I imagined that there may be indigenous cultures for whom that story of, was carried on in this, cybernetic world. We don't have that kind of continuity. I can imagine what it was like when my grandmother took the train from San Francisco through the Central Valley in the early 1900s. But that was a very different valley than it was 50 years before white people came through. When it was full of antelope and swamps and all of the migratory birds. So how do we help ourselves remember? What kind of effort gives you hope?
Well, I mean, we can do we can engage in the actual physical act of doing the research and bringing it forward and filling our museums with it and telling those stories in our communities. But we can also just pay attention at a personal level. I mean, part of what I did writing this book was just to actually, it reminded me to get out there and actually just sit down and actively pay attention to nature at times, so that I could go through this process, so I could see it again. Because in many ways it's become invisible to us. And we need to see it and care about it if there's going to be any hope of our actually working to save it. And I found it very easy to, once I begun the process of paying attention, what I was experiencing was so wonderful that it was easy to keep doing it. It's very easy to fall back in love with the natural world.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very easy to fall back in love with the natural world, and that's my hope for you. Just step outside, say hello to an ant or a bird or a blade of grass, and say, I think I could fall in love with you again. You're watching Peak Moment. Thank you, J.B. MacKinnon. James, thanks for joining me. The once and future world. Let's make it a good one.